According to new reporting from The Intercept, the Federal Bureau of Prisons is piloting a policy of intercepting mail intended for inmates, providing them with photocopies instead and withholding the originals, prompting a, quote, surveillance nightmare. The BOP has instituted this effort both within prison mailrooms and by utilizing outside private contractors. Prison officials claim the program exists in order to cut off any drugs that may enter federal facilities via soaked paper. However, there's scant evidence this actually happens, or that it poses a serious risk to the health and safety of prison staff. Democratic strategist Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and senior policy analyst at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, are here with us to discuss. Rachel, if they were really worried that the drugs were being smuggled in by being soaked in paper, wouldn't having the prison guards handle the paper, have them tripping on acid by the end of every day?
Yeah, goes right through that skin contact, man. Yeah. You got to watch out for that.
Well, sort of like how you see these local reports of cops claiming to have been near fentanyl and it causing them to overdose. There's never been, and then sometimes the articles will include, and sometimes they won't. Somebody in the medical field saying that's impossible. That just can't happen, which seems similar to this. Okay, yeah, you could actually douse paper in acid and get acid into a prison that way, but that's just not, I think, something that's happening with any regularity. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that, this seems to be one of those cases where, this sort of random, maybe one-off minor potential threat is, responded to with a policy, and no one's actually thinking about the trade-offs here. And we see this so often with elements of this surveillance state. It's like, oh, we can do this thing, so we should. And no one's thinking about it on the back end, because if you are photocopying, very intimate, private conversations, and I don't care who it's with, what are you then doing with it? Right? That's always the question on the back end. Are you storing this data? Are you, parsing it? Are you, as we see in so many cases, selling it to third parties who then use it to, geofence and market ads to, cops at the jail? I don't know. But these are questions I think that should be asked. We so easily just, see a potential threat, flip a switch, and then move forward. And it's like, holy cow, you are just rife with potential civil liberties violations here.
I still can't get past the soaking paper drugs. Right. What is that? I'm intrigued. This libertarian advocate for legalization of all drugs is very intrigued by this. Drugs are coming into prisons actually do a terrible job, right, of keeping drugs out of prison, which speaks to the greater need for legalization. That's one of the arguments I deploy. If the government cannot make prisons drug-free, they will never succeed at making anywhere else drug-free. But I digress. Jennifer, this is I view this as a civil liberties issue and a free speech issue. What do you make of this?
I happen to be in complete agreement. It's a civil liberties issue and it's a free speech issue. And I also think it makes light of the actual threats that exist in jails. There are, rampant gangs, and the staff is under threat, and they are being hurt all over the country. Not to digress, but there is an absolute crisis up in New York City right now on Rikers, both on behalf of the staff and the inmates. And this seems to make light of that nationwide. And so I think it's a ridiculous over-response. Rachel, I think you're right, to probably a one-off thing that happens somewhere. That is not a regular occurrence. It also reminds me of the old urban legend that when I was little, at least, there were these stickers that you used to lick and put on your body, right? And somehow it made it across the country that if you licked the sticker, that it had some kind of acid on it or something like that. This seems to be very similar to that urban legend. I don't know what kind of truth is behind it. And my guess is that it happened one time in some inventive way, and this has been a complete overreaction.
Yeah, I remember that. And Skittle parties, the idea that everybody was swapping drugs. People have this wrong impression about Rikers that everyone there is some hardened criminal, but there are people at Rikers who are they're young people. They're people just waiting for their court date. Yeah.
It's mostly pretrial detention.
Right. It's people who haven't been convicted of anything, and they're in these horrific conditions. So Rachel, there is a conservative movement for criminal justice reform to some degree. I think my sense is that criminal justice reform has, I guess, diminished as a national priority or talking point for the right. Some of this kind of defund the police, created an opening for a pro law enforcement counter perspective. What's your take on the current thrust of where the right is on grappling with some actual serious problems in the criminal justice system, but not wanting to look soft on crime, that sort of thing?
And Rachel, let me add to that before you answer it, because one of the best things to me that the Christian right has done over the last 10, 20, 30 years has been its role in prison reform, because criminal justice reform is great and we need it, but it too often focuses on this model prisoner. You're looking for the 75-year-old woman who's serving a life sentence for smoking weed, and you want to get her out of prison, and then you just leave the other 2+ million people who are in there, many of them for actual violent crimes. And you have to be willing to say, no, even people who are convicted of violent crimes, have a basic human dignity and need to be treated as such. And a lot of, a significant faction of the Christian right has done that and has said, no, we need prison reform. The human rights abuses going on are horrific. And to Jennifer's point, the gangs are controlling the prisons partly as a function of policy, because we've through austerity we've defunded prison guards and instead give the money to contractors and others who spend their time photocopying people's letters. So Robbie's question, where is the kind of conservative movement on prison reform today?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Christian right, because they really did work a lot, with the sort of federal representatives, Trump, on the First Step Act. There was a lot of coalition building around that effort, because to your point, I think it's been a priority for them for a long time. A lot of these nonprofits serve in the prisons themselves, do a lot of education, training, care for prisoners. And so I do think that element exists in the grassroots of the conservative movement. It hasn't really trickled up, which is interesting. The high point of it was the First Step Act. I think that was the first time that part of the right had actually been engaged at the federal level in sort of policy making. But what is, and I think at this point in time, those efforts have died to a fairly great extent. But what is interesting to me is an element that really isn't discussed that much, is that there's an element of the right that is very concerned about the treatment of January 6th prisoners, right? Mm-hmm. And they speak out very openly about, the conditions that they're being held in and solitary confinement and, all these, they're not being treated well. That is an opening, I think, for a conversation to be had, because we know it's not just people that are incarcerated for January 6th. We know these are conditions that are rife, across our prison system. So that is, I think, a wedge issue that actually could drive some bipartisan cooperation. I highly doubt it will. But
and they're completely right about the horrific conditions those people are being held in. Of course, the problem is getting Trump world to care about civil liberties violations when they don't affect Trump himself, or the whole surveillance state issues, the FBI, all that stuff. It's because Trump was the target of it that the right got upset about. But not to ignore the other side too. I think progressive activists, Democrats have overly focused on the racial element of criminal justice reform, incarceration. In my view, to the detriment of why would you make it, even though there are, of course, racial issues, why would you make it more divisive than it is? This affects everyone. And I don't know that it's really benefited the movement to explicitly cast it only in these stark racial terms.
Right. The January 6th prisoners are being treated badly.
Yes.
But they're not being treated worse than anybody else in the prison system. And if they can recognize that, and if that's the hook that gets them involved, that would be great. Actually, we should have some of them on here to see if we can bring them around to that. We'll have to leave it there for now. Rachel, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will have more Rising right after this.